Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. My name is Loretta Ellsworth. I'm a board member of the Minnesota Association of Library Friends and chair-elect of the organization's programming committee. I'm also a member of the Friends of the Lakeville Heritage Library. You'll see a little bit more of me towards the end of our time together this afternoon, as I have the honor of moderating the Q&A session with today's speaker. Speaking of, please drop your questions for Beth Steinhorn into the chat whenever they occur to you. Beth will keep one eye on the chat throughout her talk and may address a few of these in passing. But again, be prepared to be patient. We'll devote the end of our 90 minutes together to audience Q&A. Please use the hand raise function if you have a tech-related question or issue. Our tech manager, David, will be mindful of raised hands and be in touch with you individually. Now let's bring in today's guest Beth Steinhorn, president of VQ Volunteer Strategies. Beth partners with organizations and their leadership to increase impact through strategic and innovative volunteer engagement. The author of multiple books and articles, she is part of the national conversation about strategic engagement, frequently provides training on the topic, and consults with organizations throughout the US and Canada. Welcome, Beth.
Thank you, Loretta, and thank you to each of you for joining us today, and I appreciate the warm welcome. I'm thrilled to be here and be joining you virtually through this great convening. Our topic today is recruiting and cultivating volunteers, and recruiting volunteers and members has never been more important, especially as we emerge from the challenges of the past 16, 17 months. As I'll share today, Americans, not just in Minnesota, but across the country, are eager to serve, yet there remains a lot of competition for their time, for their talents, for their testimony as well. To effectively recruit, we need to not only understand those who already engage with us, but also those who aren't yet our volunteers and our members. That's why I like to always start a conversation like this, at least with a brief look at trends and with one of my favorite statements about trends, which is that ignored trends equal missed opportunities. We don't need to let trends be the tail that wags our proverbial dog. However, we have a choice to leverage some of these trends on behalf of our mission, or move forward with our heads buried in the ground and ignore opportunities that might be presenting themselves. So that's why I want to start, if you'll bear with me, with about 15 minutes of a whirlwind tour of volunteer and member engagement trends, and then we'll really dive into what are the tactics and strategies that we can use to attract and engage some of these volunteers. I'd like to start, even though, of course, we're not all in the same room, I'd like to get your voices in the room, so to speak, and make sure that everyone knows how to use the chat as well. So make sure you find the chat in your dashboard, open it up, and I'd love to have you weigh in a little bit with what you're seeing in terms of recruitment trends. Are you seeing declines? Are you seeing a certain demographic of volunteers being particularly interested? And let's focus, of course, on the last 16 months, because that's the biggest trend that's going to be informing our future as we move forward. And as you weigh in, if you so choose, with anything unique to add to the conversation, I'll be scanning it and try and share some of those as we move forward. So again, just invite you to use the chat, share what trends or challenges or successes you're seeing in your Friends Association, while I share some demographic data, population data around volunteering in the nation and in Minnesota as well. After years of declining rates of volunteering in this country, in 2017, our national population survey, the general population survey, really recorded the first major turnaround in a long time. And that was a dramatic increase in the volunteer rate across the United States. We went from about 24%, almost 25% of adult Americans volunteering to over 30%. As you likely know, as you are all Minnesotans, Minnesota has for years out-volunteered the rest of the nation. In fact, Minnesota is usually at the top or maybe second to the top of states in terms of volunteer rate, which is a great place to be. So in 2017, there was an equivalent, a parallel spike in Minnesota, but instead of being 30.3%, you have 45%, nearly half of your residents, adult residents volunteering, which means you're already at a stronger position because you don't have to convince people to engage in volunteering, period. You simply have to inspire them to engage with your association, your friends group. And we can see this here in this graphic. You can see in the United States, the decade plus decline following the 2001 post 9/11 spike in volunteering. And then between 2015 and 2017, we didn't intentionally leave out 2016 because it didn't have good data. These questions didn't get on the general population survey that year, so we don't have that data. But between 2015 and 2017, you see the nation spiking, and there's you all in Minnesota with your fabulous orange line there leading the nation in volunteer rates. And yet, it isn't all fabulous news. We need to temper this with an understanding of what these rates really look like in practice. While volunteering rates rose in 2017, which again, I know it's 2021, it's the last year for which we have data. While volunteer rates rose dramatically, there was a parallel thing going on, which perhaps some of you are experiencing. And that is that the average number of hours that a given volunteer contributes each year continues to plummet. In 2015, the average annual hour contribution was 126 hours per volunteer per year. And in 2017, despite the higher rate, the average number of hours was merely 89. And that's part of course, a larger trend of volunteers seeking shorter term, more project-based opportunities. That is likely a big challenge for your friends groups, as well as many other member organizations and associations where roles traditionally have longer tenures, like committees and boards. And yet, many of you hopefully have already been innovating and looking at event-based and project-based opportunities, which is a great way to engage people and leverage this trend in increased volunteer rates. Additionally, I know many of you may be representing, not everyone's from the Twin Cities here, and so many of you may be in rural areas and you have some of your own unique trends and challenges, like volunteers aging out, and David weighed in that many volunteers in the Friends associations, like many other association groups, are usually older, retired people who have more time, and yet time marches on. And so there's an aging out issue when we're in smaller communities and we rely on what we at VQ Volunteer Strategies like to refer to as the STP, the same 10 people. You probably have them, maybe you have the same 30 people, but that's still the STP. Those same 10 people, those same 20 people, those same 30 people often burn out. And of course, there's also informal volunteering, especially in rural areas, though in urban areas as well, where people may be less interested in affiliating formally with an organization and yet are willing and happy and eager, and it's part of their daily activities to volunteer more informally, helping neighbors, etc. And that relates to language, how we talk about volunteering as well. Another piece that I want to share, if you're interested, if you like the data side of things as I do, is that we can certainly look at, this happens to be US data, but you can find out for Minnesota as well, what types of organizations people serve with. And while 32% of Americans serve through religious organizations, almost 20% are with education organizations. So this helps us figure out how to frame our opportunities to tap into what volunteers in our region are already doing. Similarly, almost 26% engage through cultural or arts organizations, and libraries have that great opportunity to kind of have their foot in different worlds. And finally, I just want to share a couple trends pre-pandemic that we have been tracking for a couple decades now that have been affecting, driving the way people volunteer, and consequently, the way successful organizations can engage people and attract them to their organizations. I mentioned the time factor already. People are busy. At some point in our recent history, busy went from being, just a measure of our time and activities to like a badge of honor. Maybe that's a good thing or not, but how are you? Oh, busy, right? It's kind of that martyrdom piece. And yet we do know that despite people's interest in shorter term volunteer roles, that they will make time for things they value and for activities where they feel valued, which again puts the onus on our shoulders to make that case why it's worth people's time to engage with us. Second is, of course, technology. Technology has increasingly allowed us to engage individuals virtually in meaningful service, and also to empower people to leverage their networks on social media through technology on behalf of our mission. So it really gives us a tool, which I'll talk about more later, to transform people into talent scouts on behalf of our associations. Lots of ties between the economy and volunteering. Increasingly, volunteering has become a proven pathway to employment. For those, it started in 2009 in that recession. For those of us who can remember, that seemed like a really big one and yet the last year has been even more challenging. But in 2009, we saw a spike in volunteer rates as people were unemployed or underemployed because they wanted to not only roll up their sleeves and help their neighbors, but also they saw volunteering as a way to keep their resumes fresh and to gain new skills. And research backs that. Evolving philanthropy. There's always been a great tie between where people give their time and where they give their money. And now with corporate engagement, the huge rise in employee engagement, we also see ties to the way that corporations and businesses can deliver on their philanthropic goals by providing volunteers to organizations, community organizations, including libraries. We see a lot of social trends, rise in social movements and informal volunteering through community activism. There's a movement, in fact, being led in some ways, some of the research around this by one of your Minnesota-based organizations, which is a phenomenal resource I'll mention a couple times today, the Minnesota Alliance for Volunteer Advancement, formerly known as the Minnesota Association for Volunteer Administration, MAVA. And they're looking at how we can learn from what we in the volunteer engagement arena can learn from, and how we can partner with these informal community-based grassroots types of organizing. And finally, of course, generational shifts, which we have to recognize that many of our organizations, libraries included, and especially friends of associations, were created by and for greatest and silent generation volunteers, those born before and during World War II. And while they have survived and in many cases thrived in subsequent decades, the model is not as resonant with individuals in younger generations, starting with boomers, but also with Gen Xers, millennials, and now Gen Z as well. So, an interesting question. Thank you, John, for weighing in. What factors would I attribute the precipitous decline in per hour annual commitments from volunteers? I would say a couple things. One, and I'll touch on this throughout as well, but one is that starting with boomers, and again, reinforced by Gen Xers and millennials and now Gen Z, there is simply less interest in signing up for long-term volunteer roles that require a full year commitment or a regular schedule. We are increasingly living in a more flexible, on-demand world. Even this gig economy of people being able to flip on a switch on their phone and being available to drive Lyft or Uber, that's this gig mentality. So that is a big piece of it. But we also find that the research shows that people are still interested in maybe being what I term a serial volunteer. They might do one project, know that they could be flexible and take some time off and come back and do a second project, rather than saying I'm going to commit to X number of hours over this whole year. I'm going to do shorter, shorter opportunities. Now, you asked about the total number of hours. I think that has a lot to do with we live in dual income families. If there's two parents, they're generally both working more often than not, or single parent families. People just perceive that they have less time to be able to contribute in this way. Of course, all of those trends were in the works for a long time prior to March of 2020 when COVID hit, and that changed so much in terms of volunteering. While this workshop is not specific to COVID, I do want to share a couple pieces and hopefully a little bit of inspiration as well, despite the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic. First of all, according to the Civic Life Today study by Points of Light, which is a national organization around promoting volunteerism in this country, they looked at late last year pre-pandemic participation in civic life. And I want to just point out, and I'll note that you'll be getting a PDF of these slides if you want to dig deeper or look into the reports. You'll have the references there. But 36% of individuals who participated in this survey participated in volunteer activities in the year prior to the pandemic. When asked what actions will be more important than ever after the pandemic, double that, more than double, said volunteering will be important, 73%. And you might say, well, people may say that, but are they willing to roll up their sleeves and actually volunteer? And the answer is yes. Despite the sweeping disruption and devastation felt by the pandemic, individuals are inspired to volunteer. In fact, 85%, this was late last year, of nonprofits reported volunteer requests increasing by at least double that of requests prior to the pandemic. 95% of individuals believe that they would be at least as involved or do more to support their community once the pandemic passes. And further, more than half of Gen Z and nearly half of millennials and Gen X say that they will do more to get involved in their community after the pandemic. So as we are coming out of this challenging time in our history, it's really time to prepare for this potential influx of activity and convert these well-intentioned people whose data is on the screen here into realized action. And the only way that we can do that is to recognize what they're seeking and see how we can structure opportunities through our associations to tap into that. So, for example, what volunteers have wanted prior to the pandemic, but also I think continuing, and all the research shows this, is that volunteers demand flexibility, so are less likely than ever to commit to every Tuesday from 9 to 1 for the next 52 weeks. They need flexibility and self-scheduling opportunities. They want the chance to work with colleagues, excuse me, whether that be other lead volunteers or staff as well. They want to use their skills or gain new skills, and ultimately they want to make an impact. So through the rest of the session today, we're going to be looking at how we can try and tap into these trends through our messaging, through the audiences that we reach, and hopefully you'll leave with some tools and templates, as David mentioned, that will enable you to put some of these practices into action. So let's shift gears to this concept of cultivating volunteers. How do we recruit and cultivate? And I intentionally use the term cultivation, though I will interchange them. I do want to share some important nuances that I think distinguish the two. When we talk about recruitment, traditional volunteer recruitment, we often are looking at a question, asking a volunteer or a prospective volunteer, can you do this? Can you do this thing? Can you be the round peg that fits into our round hole? It makes me think of my years working in museums, which is where I started my career, where we had volunteers or prospective volunteers driving up to the museum and sitting in the volunteer office and looking through notebooks and notebooks of volunteer position descriptions saying, do I want to do this? Do I want to do this? Obviously, this was prior to all of this being able to be posted online. I'll give away my age a bit here. And recruitment is great. And yet it really is measured simply by, success measures are how many slots did we fill? How many, pardon me, how many butts did we get in these seats? And yet cultivation is something different, and it's intentionally borrowed from the fund development world. Cultivation is about relationship building. In the fund development world, we've long known that you can't just recruit a donor and check it off the list and say that they're there for life. It's about not only building that relationship, but nurturing it over the long haul. In today's volunteer engagement world, we really need successful organizations shift to a cultivation mindset where even from the start, instead of saying, can you do this? Can you do this thing and be our round peg to fit into a round hole? Instead, they start with questions like this. What skills would you gladly share with us if we could make it possible for you to do so? And if you think about that question, it helps us move beyond a simple yes or no. If it's, can you do this? The answer is either yes or no, or not now. If the question is, what skills would you like to share with us? What's your tie to our mission? How might you want to contribute? Then it's the start of a conversation where we might even be willing to negotiate and craft new roles for volunteers that are still mission driven. We don't have to say yes to every offer, but we do have that opportunity to open it up and invite people in to be co-creators of our work with us. One of the first steps is to develop a position description for the roles we're seeking to fill. Let me be clear. I do think, even though I think it's helpful and strategic to be open to negotiating new roles with individuals, prospective volunteers, we still have roles that need to be filled. We have work that needs to be done. And the first step is to develop position descriptions. I am a huge believer in position descriptions for any type of volunteer role, not just your board president and other officers, but even if it's a day of event for a large book sale, for example, it's useful and productive to craft a position description. First and foremost, it's the first chance to assess, is this role strategic? Are we able to connect it to our mission and our overall goals? Can we articulate how it drives us forward? Is it something that one person would do? I like to call this the who in their right mind. Would anyone in their right mind do this job? Test, if it passes would anyone in their right mind take on this volunteer role litmus test? Then great. Then it gives us the chance, it gives us everything we need to create strategic messages for volunteers, which I'll get to in a moment. So it helps us cultivate volunteers. It also sets us up for accountability and support, and eventually for recognition and impact. But this isn't a workshop on position descriptions, even though I could spend 2 hours on position descriptions alone. Let me just briefly give you a sample of some of the things that we believe are vital when developing a comprehensive position description and how it relates to recruitment. First is a title. And I'm sure you all know, volunteer is not a title. That might just indicate the pay grade, but it's not a title. So titles can be a real attractor for potential volunteers. People more and more are including their titles, their volunteer roles in their LinkedIn profiles and their resumes. So make this an attractive and potentially creative, though not inaccurate title. But if you're looking for someone to help you do some research on potential members, you could, I worked with one organization in Canada who called it a community, what do they call it? A community service investigator. I was like, it's like CSI. It's like a great TV show. But you can be creative as long as you're still accurate. Michelle asks, who usually crafts position descriptions? The board member, the project manager? Doesn't matter. That's a great question, Michelle. I would, without totally punting, I'd put that back out to your community and see if others do this and who does it. I would say it depends on the role. Certainly, the individual who is going to be directly supervising or supporting the volunteers in this role should have a say and at least buy into what the position description says, so they know how to hold the people accountable, how to, partner with them effectively, what's really expected, because this is all about expectations. But maybe there are boards who have member engagement chairs who might take on the task of developing some position descriptions. If you have an event lead who states we have a committee for this book sale, maybe it's the committee that develops the position description. So I'd say there's no right answer, and I invite others to weigh in on that. Another key piece other than the title is key responsibilities. It's not a laundry list of every duty. It's not show up a half hour before the event, sign in, do this, do that. It is the 3 or 4 things for which this volunteer is responsible. It ties closely to, so if it's an event chair, it's, lead a team to develop and implement a successful fundraising event. Second one might be communicate regularly with staff on progress, et cetera. And then a third one might be evaluate the event afterwards and make recommendations for future events. 3 big buckets that have a lot underneath them, but that way people understand what they'll be involved in and responsible for. Impact and outcome. What's the difference that these volunteers are going to be making? And what's that impact piece? That's really important because, as we said, people want to get involved in order to know, because they're interested in making an impact. So we need to think about how to articulate that before we even try and recruit someone for the job. So why do people join committees and boards? Well, in many cases, it's to network and meet new people. Obviously, hopefully it's because they believe in the mission. They might be interested in gaining job skills, depending on where they are with their career. But most of all, people want to make a difference around a cause that they care about. When Anne asks about where should these position descriptions get posted, thank you for asking that. In my opinion, position descriptions are not an advertisement for a job, or a volunteer position. They're an internal document that gives you what you need to craft a really attractive and compelling advertisement. So I want to distinguish the two. I think a position description should be shared internally and then with any volunteer candidates interviewing or coming forward to consider taking on the role. Think about what might be negotiable, what might not be. So it's part of a screening process if it's a long-term position for which you might be doing an interview. And it becomes a reference point, but it isn't what first gets people interested in applying. So we're going to talk about that more in a moment, and I'll share some places to post. So what does research tell us about what volunteers, what will tip the scales for prospective volunteers to consider an opportunity? I shared some data from the Civic Life Today Points of Light research about the fact that volunteers, 60% of volunteers or individuals are interested in volunteering, and over half of them hadn't volunteered in the previous year. So what is it that a prospective volunteer considers a worthwhile experience? Well, first and foremost, it's discoverable. They have to be able to find it. Ideally, it's local for many people. All of this is working in your favor in the library friends world. It's credible. Is it with a respected organization? Is it social? Might they meet people, or could they serve with their friends? Is it authentic? Is there a personal connection to it? Is it impactful? You're going to hear this theme throughout. What's the impact? And is it repeatable? So the repeatable piece, I think, is really compelling and exciting, because even though people aren't necessarily interested as they were years ago in signing up and kind of, joining to serve every Wednesday from 1 to 4 p.m., they are interested in episodic opportunities that could be repeated, whether it's at a project level or even just a day of. And when these elements are present, most people say they will make time to volunteer. So you can leverage everything you have at your disposal to recruit your current volunteers for more. You could post on volunteer search engines and portals like Volunteer Match or local volunteer centers, leverage social media, connect with partnerships and groups, and engage your community to take action, to do what really works with fundraising, which is peer-to-peer. Get people and equip them to ask their friends and share their messages. So as an example, I want to talk about this concept of peer-to-peer, or what I like to refer to as sort of this circles of influence. How do we tap into that? So this chart was actually designed for social media, but social media is really just a mirror of real life. So I like to apply it to beyond social media itself. At the center of these concentric circles is your friends association, your organization. Your community are those people who are your current members, your current volunteers. Often they're the same. They might attend your events. They're in your database. They might be following you on Facebook or other social media platforms. Beyond your community, moving out in these concentric circles, is the network. These are people you don't necessarily know and can't connect to directly, but your community can. They are the community of your community. And outside of that is the crowd. We don't necessarily know them. They don't necessarily know you, and they receive your messages from the network. Here's the thing about these concentric circles. Volunteer engagement or volunteer recruitment, we often go to our community, those same 10 people, right? And then we say, oh, where can we post these? How can we get the word out? Where should we put our newsletters or flyers? And we go straight out to the crowd. But the richest place for recruitment is the network. The richest place where we're going to be getting new people to connect with us are the community of our community. And so we need to be thoughtful and intentional about equipping our members, our event attendees, structuring our events so that we can connect with those people who attend and get them to come back and or invite their friends to join them. And research bears this out. The top incentives for volunteering, this is since the pandemic, are being invited by a friend, right? We know the ask reigns supreme. Being asked is vital. I think the other two really relevant pieces from this particular bit of research results is that when people can find opportunities easily, like through an online site like Volunteer Match or your Hands-on Twin Cities, or any other local volunteer center that has opportunities posted online, that more than 50% of people say that that is an incentive for volunteering. But almost equal to that is follow-up communication on the impact, the understanding and recognition of how I made a difference. And I know that following up with people isn't necessarily the recruitment, but they're all, best practices are really interrelated and integrated. If a person volunteers and knows that they made a difference, they're more likely to come back, and they can share that with their network of people, and it might inspire others to join in. In addition to understanding what would make an opportunity worthwhile, or what are your incentives for volunteering, I think it's equally important to just take a look at what research says about what are the barriers. Among those who expressed interest but who haven't volunteered, we see a couple key bits of data here around the barriers. 44% say they're unsure how to get involved or where to find opportunities. Almost that many, 43%, say I'm not sure what I could do that would be helpful. 41% say I haven't found opportunities matching my skills and abilities. People want to know that their unique skills are going to be useful. So one of the things, I didn't go into it in detail in that position description, but one of the things we think is vital to include in a position description are the skills and qualifications that you're seeking. Many people naturally say, I don't want to ask for too much because it might scare people away. But the opposite is actually true. When you state that you are seeking someone with good technology or database skills, experience in marketing, a great public speaker, whatever types of particular skills you're looking for, then those people with those skills are more likely to apply and connect on that opportunity, because they know that their contributions will be especially valued and recognized. So, and that relates to that more than 1 in 4, 26% say that the biggest barrier is not believing my efforts will make a difference. So that relates to that skills piece as well. So let me share a little case study. I'm going to get to some sample messages, but I want to anchor this with an example from a library, Douglas County Libraries. I'm based in Colorado, so this happens to be a large, very large, one of our highest population counties in the state, and this is a library district I've had the privilege of working with. They, full disclosure, were not engaging with us because they had recruitment challenges. They wanted to really leverage all of the skills and talents and opportunities that volunteer engagement could afford them in achieving their goals. They were in a high growth area. So they got involved with us to train and become certified as a service enterprise. It's also a process that's available in Minnesota through MAVA and Hands-on Twin Cities. And ultimately, this is about training and getting a certification that recognizes that volunteer engagement is a core strategy for their mission fulfillment. As a result, they really kind of shored up all their volunteer practices. They audited all their position descriptions. They made sure the work was really strategic. They created more flexible opportunities, and they created some new, really impactful roles. This was prior to the pandemic, but they really wanted to enhance their delivery of books to homebound residents. And so they engaged a new volunteer role as a lead delivery volunteer for homebound deliveries. They also engaged a lead volunteer for their bookstore. And they engaged a volunteer who was really tech savvy and had some experience in online sales to develop an online version for their book sales. As a result, they also, or combined with that, they also really made a big effort to be more intentional about sharing the impact of the volunteers. So for these, like as an example, for some of these roles, they talked about, they tracked the number of homebound people served and the number of books that were being delivered. They also noted how many new homebound people were able to be served because they had this expanded capacity. They talked about the increase in revenue from the bookstore, and particularly the new revenue stream for online book sales without a major impact on staff time at all. So they really shared these impact stories very intentionally. As part of that, they re-engineered their whole recognition strategy, including combining staff volunteer convenings and celebrations, so that they could really build community with the staff, which many of the volunteers sought. And even though there was a little staff resistance at first and they kind of had to pilot it and go slow, it has spread throughout all the branches. And what's fascinating to me, and I think relevant to the conversation today, is that while it was not a goal at all to increase their volunteer numbers, by shoring up all these best practices, by creating some new, really impactful roles, by building community between staff and volunteers, not to mention volunteer to volunteer, and by communicating their impact, within 1 year, they had increased their volunteer corps by 17%. So it's not just about recruitment strategy. It's about making sure that when volunteers show up, they have a really good experience and are impactful in their work. So for our remaining time together, I want to move from kind of hopefully this foundation of making the case of how this is an integrated strategy to giving you some actual tools and tips on how to develop messages, how to develop a recruitment plan, whom to reach out to, where to post, etc. So let's shift gears. I mentioned that cultivation is about relationship building, and is one of the distinctions between cultivation and recruitment is that recruitment tends to be very externally focused. It's looking for people who are outside of the organization to bring them in. But cultivation is not only looking out, it's also looking internally. So one thing I don't want to miss the chance to mention is that there are some clues, that some behaviors that show up that are good signs that an existing volunteer, even if it's just a one-time volunteer, may be ripe, may be interested or open to moving up into the organization. And those behaviors are they express aspirations, they take initiative, they ask great questions, they offer solutions, they problem solve well, they follow through, they care about results, they take on progressive responsibility. And this is my favorite, they improve after feedback, meaning they're willing to be coachable and willing to invest and learn and change behaviors. Most people aren't going to tick all of those boxes, but a couple of those behaviors are a great sign that it might be worth sitting down and having a conversation with someone and saying, hey, seems like you have some great ideas. How would you like to get involved further and maybe implement some of those ideas? When I was executive director of an otherwise volunteer-led organization whose flagship event each year was a 4-day residential educational conference that spanned all ages. It was a family-friendly event. We had a suggestion box at the check-in where families and other participants were coming to arrive and check in and get their keys to their rooms, et cetera. Well, our very first year, we looked at that suggestion box after the first or second night and saw that there was this really wonderfully long handwritten suggestion from a woman who remains a friend today named Susan, who said, the lines were really long and maybe next year you could try this and you could do this differently. Well, you've got to be certain that one of our board members sat down at a meal with Susan later that day or later that weekend and said, you had some really great suggestions. How would you like to consider heading up our participant care team next year? Because you have such great ideas, I think you could really contribute a lot. And while she didn't share it, she contributed to it in the coming year because she demonstrated some of those behaviors. But when we're looking externally, we certainly want to look at targeted recruitment. We want to find the most likely candidates. And I do believe that every position description has a target audience. The way that we can begin to define this target audience is by asking these types of questions. Who would have the skills and interests to do this work? So we want to consider professions, geography, life stage, education level. So we worked with California State Libraries a long time ago, and they had a program, this was around 2009, 2010. They had a program where they wanted to, they had a team that wanted to expand some of the programs and attendance at the library. And even though the staff member was a little uncomfortable with this, the team, she recognized the team was really enthusiastic about creating a cooking event to promote their cookbooks and to, again, this is California, to attract a celebrity chef to come and do a demonstration. And so, as they began work on this and began to really make their case and win over the staff member, they were able to say, oh, who would have the skills and interest to do this work? Well, culinary students might really want to be around this opportunity to meet and work with a celebrity chef. So when you get to the second question, who would have the skills and interests, where will you find them? The second question, well, they looked at culinary schools, they looked at associations, restaurant associations. Who knows them? Who on their board, who in their community might be able to reach out to some of these volunteers to help implement and promote these events? And finally, what information would the prospective volunteer need to make an informed decision? In other words, what we just want people to sort of click through. We want to inspire them to want to have more of a conversation with us. So what's the most compelling piece of this opportunity in terms of impact and benefits to the volunteer that we can promote to get them to sit down or pick up the phone or answer the email and talk with us further? There are lots of different, there was a question earlier about where can we, this was, I think, Anne's question. I assume these get posted someplace. Where do we recommend? So I'm going to share some pieces about messages, not the position description, but here are some ideas of where you can share messages and these postings for volunteer opportunities. In areas that still have local newspapers, that that might be a place. Maybe local radio stations, absolutely social media, coffee shop and table tents. Other, right now there are still a lot of organizations who have volunteering on hold. I know of an organization in Delaware. It's not a library, I will admit, but an organization in Delaware that is still engaging volunteers, partnered with a hospital whose volunteers are on hold because of the pandemic. And the hospital made a connection between their volunteers and this organization and sort of gave them permission and encouraged them to go volunteer at this other organization, and even gave them t-shirts with the hospital's name so they could feel like they were still promoting their hospital. But through these partnerships, they were able to really make a win-win for everyone, for the hospital that wanted to keep connected with their volunteers, for this other organization that needed volunteers, and for the volunteers because it gave them a meaningful way to engage. Senior center bulletins, congregate meal sites, faith-based organizations, and of course, online search engines and volunteer centers are great places to post messages. The question then is, what's the message? And I have a little formula, and I think you have, in the handouts, you'll see an example, a template for this. My recommended formula to get to an impactful message, a compelling message, is this. First, jot down 3 sentences about the impact of this role, right? If you had a position description, this is already done for you. What's the difference that this volunteer role is going to make? What's the impact of the Friends Association as a whole? 3 sentences, and then description of the actual tasks and commitment. And with those 9 sentences, you can then craft a brief posting that leads with impact in a way that might attract people. I have some examples coming up, but I just want to share, and you'll have this in the slide deck. There are a couple recommendations, though I always caution that in trying to attract certain generations, we don't want to be too prescriptive. Not everyone falls into the sort of stereotype of their own generation, but you can check this out if you're interested. To me, the biggest shift is between greatest and silent generation volunteers, the traditionalists, who historically have been driven by loyalty and duty and being affiliated with an association, and everybody else, starting with baby boomers, followed by Gen Xers, millennials, and now Gen Z. I need to update this slide. Mostly what unites them is a desire to make a difference, gain or use skills, and really be a driver of the impact. So here's a couple examples from a health organization. 9Health is a statewide organization that's dedicated to providing free and low-cost health screenings and education throughout their state. And what's so interesting, and they partner with local organizations, in some cases libraries, churches and synagogues and mosques, community centers, schools, to host these health fairs during certain weeks of the year. And I share them because I think they do a really great job online of getting people hooked to click through and learn more. Here's one. Do you want to make a difference in the health of your community? You want to help your family, friends, and neighbors access free and low-cost health screenings and education? Do you have skills and time that you want to share to help your community? As you click through, then they find these specific position information. It's not a full-on position description, but what I love about these is it very concisely melds impact with a reality check about the nature of the work. In other words, it's not a bait and switch. They don't succumb to that temptation of, it won't take you long at all. And then they show up and go, what? This is a 30-hour-a-week role. That's not an effective method for recruitment, and certainly not for retention. So, here's a couple examples. Non-medical and medical coordinators help recruit volunteers and assist the leadership team to plan a 9Health fair in your community. This is a major volunteer role with every fair. They're not shy. They're not too shy to indicate this is a major commitment, but what's also embedded in this is a position of influence where you could really make a difference. And then another example, bilingual volunteers. We have an increasing need for people who are fluent in more than one language, helping out on the hotlines, filling volunteer roles throughout the day of a 9Health fair, doing outreach in diverse communities. If you're bilingual, we'd love your help. They are not sounding needy or pathetic. They're sounding, strategic and saying, we need your help to achieve our goals. And there are a lot of different ways that you can do that. So I like these examples again, because I think they are clear, concise, and attractive. And they've been successful for 9Health Fair. They have 19,000 volunteers across the state of Colorado. Here's a totally different approach, just to toss out there as an example, from an organization we worked with in New Hampshire called the River Center. The River Center is a multifaceted human service organization, and they have volunteers doing a lot of different things, from providing leadership in tax preparation services that are delivered by volunteers, in helping with emergency safety net services. They even have an emergency wood bank to provide wood for heating homes. There's a lot of wood burning stoves up in New Hampshire, probably not too dissimilar from Minnesota. They also have, while they have a staff, their grant writer was a volunteer. And they recognized that that person might not be there forever. She was part of this initiative. And they recognized that they could really benefit from additional grant writers. So their solution to recruit and find new volunteers was something I've never seen, I had never seen prior to this, and I love sharing the story. They really thought beyond their own organization in finding a solution. The grant writer decided to offer a course, a grant writing circle, she called it, where she developed this 4-part class to teach anyone in the community who is interested how to write grants. It was not a fee that was calculated in dollars. The fee to participate was agreeing to research and write one grant for the River Center. So even if no one stayed on to volunteer, they got a bunch of grant proposals that went out on behalf of their organization. They did not require students who completed the training to stay with the River Center, but some did. One ended up on the board. One continues, as far as I know, to this day as a River Center grant writer. And others took that skill and shared it with other organizations in the community. Perhaps one of them was a library. And when I asked their executive director, how do you feel about training up these people to then take their skills and go somewhere else in the community? She said, we're all about helping our community. A rising tide floats all boats. So of course we'd be happy to have them contribute that. So that's a very different type of approach for a very specific skill. I wanted to share it because I think it might inspire an idea in your area. The last couple of things I want to talk about is this power of the ask. I've alluded to this. We know that most people volunteer because somebody asked them. We know that from national research. We know that just from common sense, and that we can't just rely on sending emails or what a colleague once called the spray and pray approach, right? You can't just throw a bunch of flyers out there and pray that people will show up. It means that everyone in your association, your friends group, everyone in the library has the potential to be a talent scout on behalf of the friends group. And it's up to you as an association to equip them to be an effective recruiter. It means that we want to make sure that everyone on our board, everyone who's helping on the front lines of an event, knows what roles you're trying to fill, and what you're looking for in an individual, so they can talk it up as they're standing there behind the book sale table. And if you're looking for high impact, high level roles like committee leads, board members, etc., then you might have your board go through an exercise like this that some other associations we've worked with have done, which is to have individuals articulate what's their why. Why are they involved with your friends group? What's their why? But then share with them, make sure they know the impact of the friends group overall, because their why is going to be different from other potential volunteers' why. But if they put their own why in the context of what's the work, what's the impact that our friends group has on our community, on the library, on literacy, on our, perhaps even our community's economy, then you have the beginning of an impactful story, a compelling story. And so don't overlook the chance to train people, do a little mini workshop at an upcoming board meeting, et cetera, to not only share what volunteer opportunities you're seeking to fill, but to get everyone to do a little exercise like, this is my why, here are the, here's what I understand we've achieved in the last year or in the last decade, and even role play with someone else at the table. Here's how I might tell my story, and then give a prospective volunteer the chance to imagine what their story might be. John asks a question that I think is relevant to right now. The vice chair does all of our volunteer recruitment and management, among other stuff. How does a Friends group know when it's time to break volunteer recruitment or oversight into its own separate volunteer leader role? Oh, and Anne, I'm glad you're interested in trying this compelling story piece. I would say that, I can give let me give the big consultant answer, and let me give the kind of reality answer. John, I would say, it's time to break volunteer recruitment and oversight into its own volunteer leader role if you have kind of a strategic plan, if you have some strategic priorities, and in order to achieve that, you need a bunch more volunteers, then it's time to have someone be accountable for that. that might be one trigger. But in reality, I think that, whether it's a separate role or it's part of membership or part of another piece, it can be combined, but it needs to be clear and someone needs to be accountable for it. And it's always the right time for that, whether it's combined or a standalone. But again, I invite others to weigh in, and maybe we'll have time for that. So this is a good moment as we're talking about sort of building relationships, sharing compelling stories, to at least give a nod to the importance of thinking through whether or not your organization has DEI goals, diversity, equity, and inclusion goals. And while this training is not specifically on DEI, if you have DEI goals, and obviously recruitment and cultivation is a key element of that. And there is a great resource put out by the Minnesota, now it's called, they just changed their name. So the Minnesota Alliance for Volunteer Advancement. It's a great document put out a couple years ago, and they continue to be a leader in this in the field on engaging diverse and immigrant communities as volunteers. There's a lovely brief eight-step kind of white paper that talks about the importance of shifting your language, building relationships. I'm not going to highlight all of it, but I'll just share a couple pieces that hopefully will inspire you to go look at this in a little more depth. The shifting your language piece is the one I want to focus on, that the term volunteerism is not a universal term, even though the spirit of volunteering is universal. People helping their neighbors, people getting involved is absolutely a universal value. The concept of volunteerism as connecting with a formal organization or other entity in a supervised setting is not something that's universal. And so in many communities, when they're working with immigrant communities or faith-based communities, there's a movement to shift away from using the word volunteer or overusing the volunteer, and instead making it more general. We're looking for help. We'd like some assistance. Can you show up early and help us out? So language is really, really powerful. Relationships as well, and the rest. And of course, none of this holds water unless you also have an inclusive culture once new volunteers show up. Next, let's talk a little bit about how you drive episodic or one-time volunteers to come back. And maybe it's not even just volunteers, maybe it's book sale attendees as an example, or gala attendees, people who show up once. How do you structure that experience so that it might be a bridge to engaging as a volunteer in the future? The first thing is to make sure that everyone on your front lines who's going to be engaging with other volunteers as well as participants knows what opportunities you're trying to fill. What types of volunteers are you seeking? Second, you want to equip them with an understanding that part of the success of the event is their recognizing that they're not just there to sell books, but that their success is also in potentially recruiting new volunteers, or talking it up with current, these one-time volunteers and finding out what makes them tick, and then coming back and reporting to your recruitment or your board or whoever the other event leads are, and saying, hey, this person really had some interest in XYZ. I think they're worth a follow-up phone call. And of course, the follow-up is vital. So as we think about these one-time volunteer opportunities, we want to make sure that everyone involved, including the frontline volunteers, know that their role is not just to sell the books, take the money, record the revenue, but also to talk it up and get to know other volunteers, build a relationship with them, and try and make that connection so that they're interested in volunteering. The last case study I'll share really kind of highlights this. And it's a human service agency in New York City. They had a junior board who really had to make the case to their leadership, their staff, that this was a worthwhile activity. They found a location, a neighborhood that was really appealing for young professionals to volunteer. They were seeking to get more young volunteers involved with their organization. So they started doing a series, one-time projects at this convenient location. And one of the missions of this organization was to help foster young adults who were aging out of the foster system and moving into, they were turning 21 and they were aging out of that system and moving and losing a lot of the associated supports. So they had a small group of volunteers from their junior board who invited their friends and colleagues. This is that, their community inviting their own community, which was the organization's network, reaching out beyond their same 10 people. They would invite a couple of these, their friends and colleagues to show up, not a large number, 5, 6, or 7 of them, to do a 2-hour project. In one case, I'll give as an example, it was a vocational roundtable. So they said, show up, you don't have to do a lot of preparation, we'll give you some things to think about in advance. And prior to the event, a couple days, they sent an email out and said, think about a couple examples of how you deal with stress and happiness in the workplace, or how do you deal with confrontation in the workplace, or what are your interviewing tips? And you're going to be part of a panel to answer questions on this for a group of young former foster children, young adults who were foster children, and help them out in their pursuit of a career. So it was a very manageable amount of prep work. And the interesting piece that I think is relevant is that the chair of the event, who had really created this low barrier opportunity for new volunteers to come, she knew that the event wasn't just about serving these young adults formerly in the foster system. She knew it was ultimately also a recruitment event. So she watched all the new volunteers, these one-timers. She saw who got really jazzed about it, who stayed late, who talked with people, and then they made sure that they met as an organizing team afterwards. The staff member and the event chair said, who should we have coffee with? Who should you have coffee with? How are we going to follow up and really try and invite this person into the fold? Because it was clear that they understood the difference they were making. They enjoyed it and felt it was really meaningful. The last piece of recruitment that I want to share before we open it up for discussion is that we need to really be thoughtful about what is success. And one of the tools that David will be emailing out following this is a recently published toolkit on recruitment and retention among uncertainty. And we have a lot of information in there about how to think through what are appropriate metrics for recruitment success. In order to be successful in filling all your available slots, there are other things we can and should be tracking, right? You want to look at how many interviews or conversations you're having. If you have orientations, do you want to look at orientation attendance? Do you want to look at what are your successful placements? Do you want to look at how many first-time volunteers returned and signed up for another one? I don't want to say that this has to be an enormous data analysis effort, but think through what's meaningful and start measuring it, because the more we can track what events or what types of communications have led to successful recruitment, the more we can invest in those. So if, like Anne said, we're going to be trying this compelling story, this impactful story process, then make sure you ask your board or whoever it is, your outreach team, to track who did they have conversations with. Let's make sure we know those names, and did that translate to a prospective volunteer really signing up and getting involved? Because that may be a better investment than having a whole social media campaign or taking out an ad somewhere. So that's going to help you be more strategic. It's great to try a lot of things, that's fine, but you don't want to just keep doing lots of things. You want to be intentional and strategic and try and invest in what's actually giving you the results that you're seeking. And in order to understand that, you have to know and articulate what results you're seeking. So an important piece of recruitment is really evaluating the efficacy of it. So I've shared quite a lot over the last 70 minutes. There were a lot of tools and suggestions and ideas. And before we have, we open it up totally for questioning. That's your heads up, Loretta. We'll be doing that in just a moment. I just want to give you a couple items to think about and an invitation to share any answers to these in the chat box as well. Either in the chat box or as a follow-up with your fellow team members, your fellow board members and group members. What's one aha moment you've had from today's session? What's one thing you will do differently in the next few months? And or with whom should you speak about these ideas and strategies so that it's not just on your shoulders alone, but that you're engaging the team to begin to apply some of these ideas. So I invite you to think about that. Again, you're welcome to put it in the chat. What's an aha moment? What might you try that's different that you haven't tried before? And who else should I share some of these ideas with as we move forward? And with that, I would love to turn it over to Loretta, who is going to share some of the questions with me, and we'll see what we've got. Loretta?
Okay, thanks. Wonderful ideas. I took so many notes. So
Great.
one of the questions, this is a really good question. Are there general ways we can set up our people up to volunteer smarter, knowing that they won't volunteer longer? We are blind to our own efficiencies as likely as not.
That's a great question. How to set volunteers up to volunteer smarter, not because we know they won't be volunteering longer. Not to be a total broken record, but what comes to my mind first is position descriptions. I think it's really helpful to think about what volunteer opportunities you have. And if you can't write a comprehensive and strategic position description for it, then you might need to shake yourself out of the we have to keep doing this because we've always done it this way mode and let go, shed some of those roles that aren't smarter. Nobody, even if they're going to be volunteering for, 10 hours a week for an entire year, should be volunteering if it isn't smart and efficient. So I think it would be helpful to, assess what roles you're doing and let go of any roles that aren't smart at this point. So I think that's my first suggestion around that. If I think of anything else, I'll add it later. Anything else, Loretta?
Yeah, what are some signs of volunteer burnout? We want to head it off at the pass.
I think that, and I invite others to weigh in if you'd like to answer from your experience, but signs of volunteer burnout are, people showing up less or the quality of work declining. I think facial expressions can tell a lot, right? A lot of big sighs. And, in a lot of organizations like Friends organizations, and I've worked with them in, not just libraries, but museums as well, given my background, there's often a sense that, especially among veteran volunteers, that if I don't do this, then no one will step up to the plate to do it. And in some cases, I understand that may be accurate. And yet, I also think it's important to be able to have some transparent conversations and say, we need to create space for others to fill the vacuum. And so I know the question was, what are the signs? But I think it's about being proactive and having some conversations, not just nipping it in the bud because we see someone looking tired, but rather building in systems that can prevent it from the start. So are positions time limited? Are we creating positions where event chairs, for example, are expected in their position description to also have a vice chair and train up their successor? That was in fact how that whole grant writing circle thing came along, that was about creating an apprenticeship or a, some sort of succession plan so that individual didn't have to be there. So I think those are a couple suggestions that come to mind.
And you
Loretta?
may have already answered this one. It says, what might a staff volunteer convening look like for the library?
I didn't. I'm glad you asked that one because it was a really fun example from Douglas County Libraries. They started first by having a Pi Day celebration, 3.1415, blah, blah, blah. On March 14th, it's Pi Day. And so they started with kind of this low pressure. It hadn't been an annual event, so they weren't stepping on anyone's toes. They created a Pi Day event for the staff and volunteers at a couple different branches. They served pie. Who doesn't like pie? They also had some activities and some games. And, I have to say, even though, I've been doing this a long time, but it was shocking to me that there were not staff and volunteer combined events, because in the museums where I worked, some of them, all the events were combined because the volunteers were viewed as unpaid staff. So obviously I've seen it more in other organizations now, but that was a really low, low barrier, low risk, low threat event. And so that's what they did there. But, other type, holiday events, lectures, learning opportunities, there are lots of different ways to do that. But that's what they did. They served pie.
That's a great idea.
Yeah.
How does the charity build up mechanisms, or maybe it's more of a climate where leaders can give good feedback and assign progressive responsibilities? I think there might be more to that question, but that's kind of where it ended.
Well, there's kind of a couple different things packed in there. One is a culture of feedback, which I think is great. I think that, the only way we can create a culture of feedback is when we view feedback from multiple perspectives. There's positive reinforcing feedback as well as constructive redirecting feedback. And those who are giving the feedback also need to be open to feedback. So I think it's about creating a culture of accountability where there's regular check-ins, where people are credited for their contributions and teams are celebrated for their work, and teams are involved in that feedback. So if there's an event, then their role doesn't end when the event is cleaned up. There's always a follow-up meeting with an after action review where they get to assess and provide feedback on their own successes and challenges, and then also give feedback to the library about what might be different in the future. So I think that's important, and it is tied in some ways to leadership development. And for leadership development, I think it's about, again, ensuring that it's clear that pathways are clear and realistic, that people are given small chances to build their leadership before they dive in. And you can do that a lot through piloting new roles, through having team leads, et cetera, built into projects, and share that story so you can inspire others who may not realize that there's that pathway. Hopefully that's helpful. Loretta?
Another one, we're a pretty white community. It's getting less so. Since we don't have a track record of BIPOC volunteers or leaders, just their good intentions, how do we make those first inroads? I know that we also struggle with diversity in our friends group as well.
That's an enormous question. Thank you. And again, I would really recommend that you check out the great resources from MAVA, and I'll just put in the chat, I'm gonna put their website, mavanetwork.org. done, or I'm pretty sure that's what it is. Hopefully that's it. They have a tremendous amount of resources. I think that it's about starting with learning, participate in some trainings. I think it's about so that you're ensuring that you understand what are realistic goals. It certainly is about perhaps partnering with organizations in town and building a relationship, not just approaching another organization that might be, for example, a church group or some other organization where there are a lot of people of color, and saying, hey, we want you to volunteer with us. That's not relationship building. That's not needs driven. It's about finding commonalities and connecting in that way. And I'm really going to stop there because it's such a big issue. I think you need to start by learning, figuring out what are realistic goals, and then looking into some of these best practices and recognizing that it's not something that's going to happen overnight, but we all have an opportunity to begin to make change now.
And another question, how do you get high school and college students to volunteer?
Partnering with youth organizations is great, and high schoolers and college students increasingly have community service requirements. So I would connect with local National Honor Society to see, there are community service requirements for that, and as well as all sorts of other groups. That just happens to be one I know of has a requirement, but lots of high schools have it for graduation. And again, that flexibility piece is going to be really important. Make sure that you set the volunteer requirements in a way that's realistic for students, so that they're not expected to still volunteer when they're in the middle of finals, or when they're on vacation, or particularly for college students if they're going elsewhere. You can partner with local college and university community service offices so that you can post positions there. And I would structure the roles as lasting no more than one semester. And I would include some training. Because not all teens and college students have had jobs before, paid or unpaid. So there are some training and expectations that could be geared for teens in ways that are not condescending, but are simple basics, expectations around, just appropriate dress, or whether, you need to make sure that what you hold them accountable to is the same thing you're holding adult volunteers accountable to. If you say you can't be on your phone, but all your adult volunteers are on your phone, then you can't do that. But what are the consistent expectations, and build an appropriate training. And you might get a short-term teen advisory group together to tap into their brain trust to find out what types of things would be appealing to them. Okay. My first paid job ever was as a page in a library, and I still love that was my title, and I worked in the library. That was the teen. Go ahead, Loretta.
Says one thing dissuading new volunteers from joining us is that we rightly have a reputation for doing the same things the same way year in and year out. How do you approach those sacred cows and get legacy leaders to consider changes that are good for the organization and appealing to new volunteers? Specifically, I'm talking about a big event that is heaps of work and low profit margin, if that helps.
I love this question, and I want to respect how much time we have left, so I won't go too far down this road. But this is typical not just of Friends of groups at libraries, but of so many organizations with long-term volunteers. And the magic word is pilot. How can you pilot some new types of events? Piloting is low. There's a low threat to it because you're not necessarily committing to doing it forever. And it evokes an experiment, so you get to kind of make mistakes and learn along the way. And so I would say in year one, to engage some prospective volunteers to help you design and pilot a new type of event that would achieve your goals, if it's fundraising, for example. And this isn't about proving that this is better than that, and ultimately saying this is a better bottom line than this, but it is about sharing data and looking at goals, and ultimately in assessing what are the right events moving forward. But I would pilot some events and tell the volunteers or prospective volunteers that you'd like them to come in with an entrepreneurial spirit and help you generate some new ideas. That's how California State Libraries ended up with that or that one library ended up with a culinary event with a chef that turned out to be really successful because staff and leadership was willing to step back and say, we're going to let this team develop a volunteer-led initiative and own it, and then we'll kind of assess and share the results. So that's my tip around that.
Okay, we have a couple more questions. It says, how do we push back against the stereotype that friends of the library are all boomer women who read? We're not in our case, but the reputation is not helping us get new blood. Which is,
well, I would say that's about just some good marketing sense. If you have a website, you know, who's on the website, what are the pictures? Are they all boomer women with books and glasses? You know, or, you know, how are you representing it? What are the stories that you're sharing? And my guess is you probably have someone in your area who has some marketing experience who might be able to volunteer to help you try and overcome that image. Not that there's anything wrong with boomer women who read, but who are your spokespeople who are out front doing the work, and how are you not just capturing their image, but capturing their voice and telling that story? If you have teen volunteers, how are you getting that word out there as well?
And then what are the ingredients to a gangbusters volunteer recognition event? We are having our first ever in October once COVID restrictions are lifted. Sounds great.
So congratulations. I'm sure that's really exciting. You know, recognition is another really big issue that I think I'll just leave it at this. Research continues to show that volunteers increasingly want to be recognized by understanding the impact that they have. Many volunteers today, I don't know yours, but many volunteers today are not that interested, especially if part of their role is raising funds, in having a bunch of funds spent on them. They'd rather see the information, not the information, the funds rolled back into the mission of the library. So it's about, you know, sharing the impact of the work, having some fun, and I think post-COVID, just giving a chance for people to connect with each other. I know some great post-COVID or even during COVID little recognition things that have been popular among, not for a big event, but videos. You can go on things like Cameo and get celebrities to do videos, or comedians. You know, you can just get a short little, you know, lighthearted humor. People want things that are uplifting and a chance to connect with each other, but it's only meaningful if you share what the impact is. It's not about menu and flowers and tablecloths.
Okay, and well, thank you so much, Beth. This has just been invaluable. It's great. Heads up, you guys, everyone will be receiving an email with lots of goodies, including handouts, as Beth mentioned. And Beth will be back in December for a follow-up webinar about volunteer retention, which is perfect, considering that today's program was about recruitment. So I want to thank you again, and thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
All right.